Hello again and welcome to another episode of the Franchise Everything podcast where we talk about everything and anything franchising. I'm at another episode with Vanessa Wilmot, the Managing Director of Geotech. How are you, Vanessa?
I'm going well, thanks.
Excellent, excellent. Now, this is our last one today. We've done a few nice little tip ones here. So this one is one that I've wanted to chat with you for months about, and this is about failed franchise locations and what went wrong, because no one wants to talk about failed franchise locations, do they?
No, they don't, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I'd like to unpack these a bit more and really figure out. We're going to run through some we're not going to use brand names or anything like that, but some scenarios and stuff like that to give some examples for some learnings.
Sounds good.
So how often do they get it wrong, like franchise locations?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, as you mentioned before, no one likes to talk about it, but I think by talking about it, it actually can help a lot of different brands to identify why that, went wrong, so it can stop other brands making similar mistakes. So I'd love to sit here and say everyone gets it right all the time, everything's great. But unfortunately, we're all human. Mistakes do happen, or, franchisors could be really enthusiastic and maybe they haven't set things up properly from the beginning to get their brand up and running.
No one wants to admit when they've got it wrong, clearly. No one's going to say, yeah, we got that wrong.
Exactly.
Or do they ever admit it, do you think? Or
they do sometimes, yeah. I guess they have to admit it, though, if they need to reverse it or they need to set themselves on a new path.
So the reverse is an admission, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, I think things go wrong more often than what people will admit. So unfortunately, when you ask sort of how often does it go wrong, it probably goes wrong more often than you realise. But then I guess the most important thing is about whether those brands then acknowledge it and then move forward and put themselves on a better chance for success thereafter is what's most important. Yeah.
So what do they get wrong? So why do things go wrong? I'm sure it varies depending on the thing, but what sort of things do you see?
I think one of the biggest things is not doing their research or their homework maybe from the onset, and I think that can then lead to things like when things go wrong would be in terms of putting stores in the wrong location. So if we're talking about stores, maybe thinking that their key target market is someone different to what it actually is in reality.
What they really want the person to be.
What they want the brand to be, but it's maybe not what the brand actually is based on consumer buying habits and travel patterns and movements. The other one that we see is in terms of territory planning, so maybe giving areas away that are much too large. Can also happen the flip side too, where sometimes too small, but mostly we see more too large than too small.
I see that quite a bit in my experience of years of helping brands grow.
Yes.
Especially newer, younger brands trying to make their offer more compelling and more appealing.
Yes.
By saying, we'll give you a massive territory. Look at the opportunity in this territory. And then they realise 2 or 3 years down the track that they're missing all this opportunity because that person owns that whole territory.
Exactly. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, you see that quite a bit. All right. So we're going to jump into some examples. So how long have you been doing this for?
Nearly 25 years.
There you go. So you've seen a thing or two.
Seen a thing or two in that time.
I've always talked about what some war stories are and all that sort of stuff about it, because everyone's got some stories there. And once again, that no one really wants to talk about too much.
Yes.
So we're not mentioning brands at all, but let's just mention, so what's the first scenario that we're going to talk through that went wrong?
So the first scenario is a network that has a network of stores.
Yep.
And they were sort of fairly established, not they're sort of like we were in the medium sort of growth stage. They weren't new, but they weren't sort of nationwide yet, or they weren't sort of absolutely everywhere.
So that could be anyone, I imagine. I'm just with like 100 stores or something, even in 100 to 80 to 100 stores.
Maybe 50 to 80 stores, probably more like that.
So they still had a bit of an idea. They're still a well-tested model.
A well-tested model that they could have learnt from. So this particular brand, they thought that they were really sort of a hip and trendy brand. They were attracting a lot of young adults and university students and that sort of thing. So they started opening locations in places like Melbourne, like Paran and St Kilda, so really more, hip and trendy types of precincts where they thought that their key target market would be.
Yep.
And they were wondering why these types of locations, they actually weren't performing. They were actually some of their worst performers in the network. And then if you think about the types of rent that they would have been paying in those types of areas, they were actually, I would go as far, and the topic for this podcast is I would actually say they were failing in those locations. They weren't profitable. And they really didn't understand why, because they thought they were hip and trendy. Surely they're the types of areas they should go in. What actually happened was analysis was undertaken because they did have, a decent store network to learn from already. And the analysis actually revealed that they perform best in areas with families. So as you can imagine, a key target market of families is a very different key target market to someone that's young, adult, hip and trendy. So what they did from there on, and I have to say that, at first they didn't want to admit it. They wanted to think their brand was cool, trendy.
Like everyone thinks their brand can do everything.
Be all things to all people. And that can actually be a mistake too, because what that can actually do is start to alienate who their true key target market is, because you can imagine that, someone with children going somewhere is going to be very different to where universities might hang out. And this was a food-orientated brand, by the way, as well. So what they did was, armed with that knowledge, it took a little bit of convincing and using the data and science, though, to show that their key target market was really more families. They then reset their whole strategy to then relook at opening in more family areas, and that did set them. And I think they might have ended up closing those stores that they'd opened in those.
So how far did they go down that path?
Luckily, not too far. It may be a year down that path, but they hadn't opened that many stores in those types of areas before they then were able to turn that around. And
so it's basically brand blindness almost something, isn't it? It's like just forgetting about who your actual core consumer was.
Exactly. That's right. And I think the point that you mentioned before, the core consumer, but then also staying true to that core consumer and going in those types of locations where they will be located. So if you think about, families, areas where there's schools or there's people, like a lot of residents that are high proportion in families, so more middle to outer suburban rather inner sort of suburban areas and that sort of thing.
So in your experience, how do people make that mistake? Because experienced franchise executives, I would have thought, would see that as fairly obvious. Was it literally that brand blindness and thinking, no, we're doing that well, we're flying, we can traverse across? Yeah,
I think it was that brand blindness, or thinking that they were all things to all people, or that they were maybe something that they weren't. I think it was purely that. So
it was a lack of honesty with themselves.
Yeah.
Okay.
But to their credit, they did gradually take on board the feedback, and then that did set them on the path for growth and more success for the brand.
And I know now that they're much bigger.
Yes.
Okay, the next one. That's a great little study. What's the next case study? We're going to talk about it. For as far as what went wrong in failures and some examples.
Yeah, definitely. So the next study case study I can think of was a territory-based network. So this particular brand, they operated on a model where there was territories, and then they would put one store within that territory, and then no other store or no one else could enter that territory, and they could not market within that territory as well.
And it was a destination type brand?
A destination-driven brand.
Yep.
So for a destination-driven brand, territories can be quite important, and these were legally binding too. So they're all in all their legal agreements. So this particular brand, later on, where they were trying to do a more optimum territory planning kind of exercise across all of Australia, and at this stage they probably only had about 30 stores. So they had 30 legally binding territories. And what happened in this particular case was a bit like what we were talking about before. The first couple of territories, or the first few territories that were given away, were massive, and they covered something like a third of Sydney or a third of Melbourne, because like you said earlier, they were very enthusiastic. They had new franchisees
really wanted to
coming
close
on board,
some deals.
Close those deals, look at all the opportunity.
Yeah.
And the analysis of their territory plan and what an optimum territory should look like, it actually revealed that some of these could have fit 3 or 4 retail stores. And the problem with a retail store type of operation, even though the territories were important to them, it meant it really prohibited their growth in terms of being open, another store
it prohibits
in the same
everyone's
territory.
growth done, because that brand doesn't grow. There's less money to the marketing fund.
Exactly.
So it actually impacts that franchisee as well.
It impacts that franchisee too. So they have spent, I would say, probably the last 10 years. So it's taken them a long time to unwind all of that, working through all of that. And they've actually moved across more now to primary marketing areas, which are much smaller.
Yep.
And they're more marketing areas that brand, only that store can market within those areas. So, and that's a much better system for them. So it doesn't prohibit their growth, but they also do use cannibalization models too. So they always look at things like cannibalization before they open any new stores. But it's taken them probably 10 years to get through that.
It's a massive impact, isn't it? It's interesting because I suppose the first thought that I had talking about this concept of this podcast with you was failed locations, what went wrong, as in the franchisor choosing the wrong location.
Yes.
And putting it in, and that being to the detriment of the franchisee. But in fact, this problem that you're talking about is really too large a location to sell to a franchisee, and it being to the detriment of the entire network.
Exactly. Yeah. And one of the other strategies that in this particular case, and we've seen it before as well, was because they had to sort of try and unwind these ones that could have fit 4 stores in them or 4 territories. One way around that was, I know that in one area they did ask the franchisee if they wanted to become a multi-unit franchisee, and because they were a good operator. So they were a great operator. They were overperforming, which was probably because they had such a massive area too. So that was a good strategy as well to try to mitigate instead of trying to say, look, your territory moving forward is going to be a quarter of the size. Because then the franchisee would want compensation. So one strategy was in the cases where, it was a great franchisee that they became a multi-franchisee operator as well.
I imagine those, like on renewals of franchise agreements, and they say, look, we're going to change the territory. I imagine that's a very difficult conversation.
Oh, absolutely, because there'd have to be something in it for the franchisee or, they're legally binding, and that's why it has taken that 10 years, because it's that planning leading up to it. It's having those hard conversations, what they're going to do about it, and then it's actually unwinding it. And different franchise legal agreements come up for renewal at different times. So, it was a bit of a tricky one.
It shows you just how important it is to get it right to start with.
Exactly.
It can be like a decade, as you said, to unravel it and then unlock it again. And by then, competitors obviously come into the territory and everything as well.
And that's another consideration too. So if a competitor comes in and a competitor opens in that same sort of geographic area, 3 or 4 stores, and then this particular brand might have only had 1, so that's a detriment to everybody, like you said. So
okay. Well, that's a non-foodie. So on to another case study you're talking about. So I think we're going to do 3, weren't we?
Yes.
So you've got a third one. What's your third example you were going to give?
Yeah, so the third example was a brand that's very skewed towards Western Australia. So this particular brand is a food-related brand. They really dominate in Western Australia, and they do really well there.
And there's a few like that there, isn't there? There's a few very Western Australian brands.
Yeah, and they do incredibly well. But if you think about somewhere like Western Australia, it's a very different market to markets on the east coast of Australia, such as, Sydney and Melbourne. So with a lot of brands, particularly if they're only in one market, they think, okay, what's one way that we can grow the brand? We've pretty much exhausted all of our opportunities in Western Australia or in Perth. So they might, look at the eastern side of Australia to think about, that's our strategy for growth, is to open up in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, for example, on the east coast. So what we've seen is sometimes brands think, oh, okay, so we just do exactly the same thing that we do in Perth and apply that in Sydney and Melbourne. And in this particular case, they had that mentality, and then they started opening locations in Sydney and Melbourne, and they weren't doing anywhere near as well as they were in Perth. And a big part of that, and we do see that particularly in Sydney, is that Sydney and Melbourne, for example, have very different demographic compositions to Perth. They're much more ethnically diverse, much more cosmopolitan, different types of areas, higher student populations, lots more international students. So it's really thinking about how that brand would transition to the East Coast and doing the research, the homework, and really trying to find out how the brand may translate. But because a brand works in Perth doesn't mean it's going to work in Sydney, for example.
I think there's a lot of things you could potentially have to change, not just location strategy.
Yeah, even the product offer as well. So if they are opening in a ethnically diverse area of Sydney, does the offer align with the palette of the types of ethnic groups that are within those pockets of Sydney as well? So a lot of thought and strategies to go into that. And we have seen it a lot of times where some brands, not even between Perth and Sydney, but even going from Sydney to Melbourne or vice versa, sometimes it can be very different, and it's thinking about the different markets. So you do see quite difference in Melbourne and Sydney? Yeah, so we have seen a lot of brands that I think Sydney tends to be probably one of the hardest markets to crack for a lot of brands that aren't there. A lot of brands say that. I know a lot of brands who aren't there, so we just need to sort Sydney. Yeah, because Sydney has… Why is that, do you think? Because I do hear that a lot. Yeah, I think it's just I think a lot of it does come down to a lot of the different ethnic enclaves in Sydney and the different appeal to different ethnic groups, and they've got higher concentrations of the different groups within Sydney as well.
Yeah.
It's probably the best way to describe it. It's more contrasting, and then you've got the different socioeconomics. So you've got from ethnic point of view, you've got, the southwest Sydney areas, which are very, very, some brands, especially food brands, find it hard to crack because of the different ethnic groups there. The other one is, the income profiles are much higher in Sydney. So then you've got places like the North Shore of Sydney. So it's a bit more,
it's almost
diverse,
chalk and cheese type of in certain spots of Sydney.
In certain spots and making sure that you are going to the right types of locations for your particular brand.
Excellent.
To either fit into those ethnic groups or those income profiles.
Well, it's good you've got you to go through all that data and everything, no doubt. So I imagine you get a lot of brands coming to you trying to crack the puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So, it is about finding out where a store or a brand performs best, where they currently are, and trying to find the most like areas in different markets of Australia for the highest chance of success.
Yep.
But, the other thing could be climate differences too. So a brand could work really well in Queensland. It could be an ice cream shop or something like that, but maybe not work so well in Canberra or Melbourne because it's colder. So it is about, there can be even things like climate that can be different and have an impact. It can be things like different competitors in different state markets, the different ethnic groups, different demographic differences. So there's a lot of different considerations, but it could also just be that the brand doesn't resonate in different markets as well. So
I reckon that would be quite a bitter pill to swallow, or quite a tough pill to swallow for many
definitely.
brands. Yeah,
absolutely.
Excellent. All right, well, great insights once again, Vanessa. Thanks so much for joining us. Excellent.
Thanks very much, Glenn.
And that's it for another one of the Franchise Everything podcasts. Hope you got a lot out of this one. Lots of great little tips and insights there. We'll catch you in the next one soon.